Across my favorite action games, combat is the most dominant form of moment-to-moment gameplay. I think that part of the reason for why combat is so popular is its visceral appeal. The act of mutual combat is naturally stimulating. Trying to kill a guy while he tries to kill you is about as direct and primal a premise can get. It's so relatable to basically everyone because the fear of death is common and instinctual in like 99% of people. Combat also might be so popular for the same reason that stupid, loud, and obnoxious action movies are so popular. There's no denying that combat is just plain old dumb fun. Combat is also a double whammy because not only does it help draw audiences in by being stupid and flashy, it also gives developers a clear and established framework for implementing mechanics. Engaging in action systems will demand so much more from you than, say, what a movie demands from the viewer in any given action sequence. Rather than just passively observing two sexy, sweaty men fight it out on the big screen, combat systems in video games can test so many different skills like spacing, reaction speed, pattern recognition, resource management, target prioritization, and so fucking much more that it's actually insane to think about. And because of this stuff, it's really easy to see that combat comes as a natural premise in many action video games. That's why to me, it's a little bit surprising, or at least ear-perking, whenever a new game is released in a genre dedicated to avoiding combat. Stealth, in other words. I probably shouldn't be too surprised at all, considering that there are games that are way out there like Pigeon dating sims, or border control themed paperwork checkers. But as a concept, just the thought of taking part in the things that you do in these other games are somewhat less interesting to me, at least for the purposes of this video, because they're so far removed from and foreign to the world of combat that they're almost completely in different schools of thought altogether. Not shitting on these games at all though, these games are actually great experiences in their own rights. I guess that, with the exception of a handful of games, the fundamental fail-state language of your average video game just boils down to the management of some kind of health meter or life counter, or maybe a combination of the two. Many games that aren't explicitly about combat still borrow that same logic. Failure to keep either from reaching zero means some form of reset of progress, either through permadeath or more leniently restarting from a checkpoint nearby. So in that case, I guess most games really aren't that different from each other, with most stealth games as no exception. Still, I've always thought that conceptually, stealth is an interesting outlier, because the act of stealth exists on the fringe of combat. Of course, combat might still exist in many of these quote-unquote stealth games, but they can act more so as a punishment, a buffer between regular gameplay and the fail state, if not just an outright fail state. In fact, if you get caught in some of these games, the games just turn into really shitty shooters or really shitty action games, which makes sense because combat isn't really the point of these games at all. A detractor's reductive take on stealth gameplay might be, all you do in stealth games is avoid enemies' cones of vision, or move the joystick or D-pad ever so slightly so that enemies can't hear your footsteps. It's hard for me to disagree with that because essentially that's what stealth boils down to even in real life. Plus, there's still an inherent flaw, or at least an issue that I perceive to be a flaw in this type of stealth gameplay. Even the greatest stealth games still have this one unfortunate scenario in spades. I like to call it the stealth curse, just because I don't know what else to call it. Many enemies will have routes or walk patterns that they cycle through, and sometimes there are just too many fucking enemies to keep track of for you to reliably and consistently keep tabs on everyone without something inevitably slipping through the cracks. I'm pretty sure there's some kind of psychological term named after this exact phenomenon, but it can feel like enemies just perfectly stumble upon you at the exact moment you do something illegal. Again, the enemies aren't programmed to seek you out when you're sneaking around, it just feels that way because of how multiple enemy patrol routes and player actions intersect. If you want the most optimal outcome, which is not getting spotted, you have to slow your ass down much of the time and pay close attention to where patrolling enemies are at all times, even if they're what feels like miles away from you, because they can and will creep up on you. As you can see here in this clip, because I didn't fully check the floor I was in and wasn't paying attention, the exact moment where I lured a guy down to this floor, another guy came in from the opposite direction to fuck me up. I was just lucky no one else was around to witness it to end my run. Ah, you stupid bitch. I hate you so much. On its own, there's nothing wrong with this type of challenge. Part of mastering a stealth game is staying attentive, routing the level, learning the ins and outs of patrol routes, and figuring out the best timing to do illegal shit in. The more meaningful systems the player is asked to learn, the better. The problem is, if you're not willing to put in the time to learn speedrun strats, but you still want to successfully avoid getting caught, this can oftentimes mean just sitting around and waiting for the right moment to advance. A good chunk of time you'll be spending in any stealth game is you just waiting around for the optimal moment to advance. It's still gameplay because there's no one taking control away from you, but it's just like not stimulating gameplay. If you compare this scenario to the moment-to-moment gameplay in action games, especially Danmaku's, there is more meaningful decision-making in micrododging a single 5-second bullet pattern than there is 1 minute of waiting around for the right time in a stealth game, which if you really sit back and think about it, it's just fucking nuts how bad this problem is. Of course, there's always tiers of optimization in games like these. God tier speedrunners can circumvent and eat this shit up for breakfast, getting sub 1 minute runs and stuff by doing batshit insane optimizations, but I'm willing to bet that only like a small percentage of players in these communities are capable of doing stuff like this. What's important to note is that surviving bullet hell is both a skill check and the baseline. Every player is forced to dodge, bomb, cancel, or fail, whereas failing a stealth curse scenario and getting caught can come from poor execution, stemming from impatience. If you ask me, patience is a way less interesting skill to put to the test. Of course, not every game needs to be super tough, fast-paced arcade experiences. Some games would be worse off if this were the case. These are just inherent problems with how stealth works. So if you tell me that you're not a fan of stealth games because of this stuff, I'd completely understand where you're coming from. However, if you tell me that stealth is just a boring chore, I think I'd have to disagree with you. There are plenty of activities that you can partake in within games that are just chores. Logging into a game, clicking on a macro you copy-pasted from the internet somewhere to automatically complete crafts, turning them in, claiming your finite weekly rewards, and then waiting to do it again the next week, and then the next week, and then the week after that is a chore. The opposite of fun to me. Stealth isn't. At least not when it's properly gamified. There is a sort of thrill in the act of successfully avoiding combat, or by finishing a mission completely ghosting your enemies with no traces. I guess another issue I see with stealth as a genre is that it isn't very cleanly defined, because it can come in so many different configurations. Sometimes stealth isn't a formalized mechanic per se, and it comes in a more organic player-made variation. In many multiplayer shooters, you can snipe someone from across the map or knife them from behind without them knowing you were even there. Is that stealth? Yeah, sure, but I wouldn't really call COD or Battlefield stealth games. And when stealth is formalized, it can also just come as a side dish, as many action games might include some shallow form of stealth, usually just there as a way to get 1 or 2 free kills before the real action starts. Thus, despite having stealth in it, you wouldn't really call games like Ninja Gaiden 4 or Sekiro stealth games. Games like Hotline Miami or Deadbolt feature stealth, but you wouldn't really call these games stealth games because the goal is less moving unnoticed and more taking enemies by surprise. The solid games are never purely about the stealth. One look at the insane bosses confirms that.
Well, she's got a very cute behind.
Even the original Metal Gear has a combat state, and weird bosses. I don't really know what constitutes a true stealth game. In a traditional puzzler, really all you're doing is solving puzzles. In a traditional racing game, all you're really doing is turning corners at the apex and passing your opponents. Yet, I can't really think of a single game that can be called a traditional or pure stealth game. Maybe it's because most developers think stealth is too abstract a concept, or maybe it's because developers think that stealth can only exist in relation to other systems. I don't know. There's too many variables, too many games that do stealth, but also include combat and vice versa. I think that the intent behind including a combat state is to give less experienced players a buffer between getting spotted and outright failure. Weaving in and out of stealth in combat sounds like a compelling concept, sure, and getting into a dangerous shootout that threatens to end your run definitely incentivizes you to not get caught. But this doesn't make much sense when you get bonuses for finishing the mission completely stealthily, and especially when you can just reload from a save and erase your mistakes entirely. The tension from getting caught and getting into a combat state just becomes a nothing burger. In these cases, you might as well just just get a game over screen as soon as you get caught, because you'll just be restarting from a checkpoint anyway. Out of all of the stealth games I've played, the roguelike freelancer mode in Hitman World of Assassination comes the closest to justifying the inclusion of combat, simply because runs can take a while and you can't save. Good old semi-permadeath forces you to take the combat L when you get spotted. Failure to hide or kill everyone shooting at you and you'll lose your run. But Freelancer 2 has its problems, because it doesn't have a robust scoring system which rewards the silent assassin accolade in the same manner the standard mode does. That's kind of the recurring theme here. Even when a game gets close to solving these problems, it usually just introduces a new set of trade-offs in the process. Funnily enough, I suppose those shitty streamer bait horror games, where you can't really defend yourself against the monsters and can only run away and hide, might be promising. But admittedly, they're not really an avenue I've gone down. I'm not a pussy, you're a pussy. Shut up. There are plenty of stealth games that come kinda close, but never fully commit to going full stealth. Maybe there's one staring me right in the face and I'm just too much of a dumbass to see it. I don't know. Plus, I'm too dumb and lazy to try and classify what is and isn't a true stealth game. Getting a clear answer for this probably doesn't even really matter, and I don't think anyone really gives a shit about getting a clear answer for this question. Unless, of course, you're a fart-sniffing, pseudo-intellectual dickbag like me. But I do know one thing. Do you know what a radar or a spider chart is? I've seen them before in Pokemon games and probably in school somewhere, but I didn't know what they were called until I looked it up just now. This is a spider chart. Spider charts can be useful because, just at a glance, they allow for really quick identification of something's strengths and weaknesses. Like how you can see that this Gardevoir is tough and cute more than he is cool or beautiful. I think that if you put the strongest games into a spider chart to see their strengths and weaknesses, you'd see that they aren't really well-rounded. They'll look more like this, leaning much more heavily into one or two particular attributes. FF16 is the most recent example of this that comes to mind when I think of this stuff. It's a huge departure from previous Final Fantasy games, because it wants to be DMC, but also an RPG, and a story-heavy cinematic experience at the same time. However, the pacing and gameplay suffers heavily, because it wants to keep those RPG tropes around, even though they don't meaningfully support the combat system. Plus the poor execution of a whole slew of other garbage, which most certainly requires a dedicated video. As a result, FF16 doesn't fully commit to being an action game, its RPG elements are actually a fucking nothing burger afterthought, and neither the action nor the RPG in the game get the depth to really compete with the best in both genres. I don't hate FF16. In fact, I like it quite a bit, because it's insanely cool at times. If you ignore the numerous issues, FF16 has a touching story and an extremely hype, goated soundtrack, which perfectly complements the fucking bonkers Azura's Wrath set pieces. It really elevates the experience, at least to me. But those are really the only things I can praise about it, so the game doesn't really stick in my head for too long. Aside from the soundtrack, I listen to that daily. The point I'm trying to make is that games that focus much more on certain aspects or lean heavily into specific qualities are often much stronger than games that try to do a large number of things at once. Being good at everything doesn't translate perfectly into being excellent at any one or two things. I'd like to be clear now because this type of bold statement tends to be contentious. This isn't always the case. You can definitely prove me wrong by finding some games that don't lean so heavily into one or two aspects, and instead do a bunch of things that make for incredible experiences. See any Zelda, Soulsborne, or any Team Ico game, and many more. In these games, even if individual systems like combat might not be the deepest when viewed in isolation, they're elevated by everything else around them. Strong level design, storytelling, art direction, atmosphere, and overall cohesion are what push these games far above the rest. However, those are rare exceptions. If games aren't gonna go super hard into one aspect, then I want them to do a whole bunch of shit really well. I want that to be the norm rather than the exception, but that just isn't the case. Too many games try to chase that dream. Unfortunately, the balance is very difficult to achieve, judging by how often this approach fails for me. What's worse is when a core part of the experience in what were once more focused games becomes diluted. Can you imagine if they slapped a generic, empty open world from every other AAA game onto Metroid, the series they named the fucking Metroidvania genre after? So just as combat, platforming, or puzzling is a core concept to build mechanics around, I think that stealth can really work too, but it's only really worth it when it's the point, not just another option in the toolbox. That's why over the past couple of years, I found myself craving for more and more good games that really go hard into stealth or stealthy systems and little else. I fucking love the Hitman World of Assassination games, for example, and I know it's super popular, but if you haven't given it a try already, I think you should. Stealth is strange. To me, it's kind of hard to define and has some problems that devs are still figuring out. But when it works, it offers a different kind of engagement that combat-heavy games can't replicate, which I find to be very valuable. So whenever a game comes along that's brave enough to go all in on stealth, I'll be keeping my eyes peeled for any new sneaky releases.